Hello and welcome back to Radio Rothbard. I'm Ryan McMaken. I'm executive editor at the Mises Institute, and with me, as always, is my associate editor, Tho Bishop. And we're going to talk a little bit about the issue of defamation this time. And this has come up more and more, surprisingly. It seems like some minor legal issue is what it should be. You don't really talk about libel and slander and those sorts of things in daily life a whole lot. Most normal people don't really hire attorneys to sue people when they badmouth them. But what's been interesting is this nexus between suing people for defamation and essentially silencing them on things that really don't have much to do with really criticizing people specifically for their private lives and things like that. These are just issues where people are finding themselves in trouble with the regime because people are spinning more and more creative ways to sue them for defamation, which has the end result of shutting people up and using the legal system to do that. And if you look back at the writings of Rothbard and some of the more hardcore libertarian writings, Walter Block, for example, there's a great skepticism of whether defamation is even a real issue. Because, right, how is me saying things some sort of violence or aggression against another person? So we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. But just as an illustration of how absurd the whole issue has become, I noticed that just the other day, Donald Trump was found guilty in a civil trial and found liable for defaming a woman. And what did this defamation consist of? He denied that he was guilty of the charges that she was leveling against her. And usual Trumpian language, oh, she's awful, I don't even know who this woman is. And somehow then this counts as defamation. But this example, I think, serves a good point of how absurd really defamation is once you start to pick it apart. Because let's just consider a situation where Trump says something nasty about another person. Okay, so some woman said Trump did something illegal, violent, awful toward her. He then in response says, oh, she's ugly and I hate her and she's stupid and I would never touch her and she's lying. All right. Well, God forbid Donald Trump say that I'm lying, because we all know everybody believes automatically everything Donald Trump says. But the concept of defamation is heavily based on this idea that you say something and everyone else just automatically takes it under consideration and considers it plausible. But the last time I checked, we don't live in a society where everything that Donald Trump says is considered of the utmost veracity. And of course, yeah, the man has his devoted followers who apparently believe most everything he says, but I would submit that even a lot of his devoted followers know that he's just full of BS a lot of the time. They just like him because they figure this guy's better than the other scum that's running for president. So I think that's something we have to keep in mind, is Trump said something. Why are we supposed to believe that damages were then incurred as a result of Trump saying something? Because it would seem the assumption then is that everyone believes what he said, and therefore now they hate this woman too because Trump said he hates her and that she's dishonest. I don't see how that translates into society in general ostracizing this woman because the word of Donald Trump holds so much weight. So I find just the whole premise to be absurd, and I don't think I'm the only one, right? Though, I mean, I think there's been a definite strain of thought along these lines just from other writers like Block and Rothbard as well.
Right. And I think this issue of defamation is one that is going to be an increasingly important one, because the number one concern of the regime, right, is misinformation. It's conspiracy theories. It's the undermining of democracy by saying things that aren't approved. And of course, the way this mechanism is working right now, it goes one way. This, again, is another example of a New York City jury finding Trump guilty of something in this particular case. And I think you could probably prosecute Trump for just about anything right now and probably have a jury of Democrats find him guilty. And chances are you're going to get that if you're in a city like New York, if you're in Washington, D.C. We've seen this play out. I mean, the Alex Jones lawsuit and the damages that that the court found him guilty of for things that he said or didn't say on his show. There's this very sinister dynamic of the increasing politicalization of the court system. Obviously, there's always been part of that baked in there, but the weaponization of defamation laws, I think, is only something that is going to grow. And actually, someone who had a good article about this not that long ago is Brian Kaplan, who talked about the use of lawsuits as the hitmen of the state. And he was comparing, in his article, the Texas abortion heartbeat bill, where there was a dynamic where citizens could file lawsuits on behalf of, an unborn child if they suspected the parent of, having an abortion across state borders or whatever. And so he said, well, here's an example of this on the conservative side of lawsuits being used as a weapon of the state. But you can also look at some of the changes in terms of, hostile work environments where the court has found that, you explicitly have to silence Archie Bunker types, which is actually within the judicial decision there. Archie Bunker types, you can't allow people to say things that will offend someone. And obviously that's a little bit of a different dynamic than saying something publicly against you, as in the case of defamation law. But we're very clearly seeing that the use of language is an increasingly weaponized phenomenon. There is willingness within the court system to act upon this. Because I have a feeling that you're not going to see, when CNN does a report about Tucker Carlson moving his show to Twitter, and they have right there, in the tweet, in the article, headlining it, right-wing extremist Tucker Carlson starts show after, all this words violence stuff. I have a feeling that Tucker Carlson is not going to find any defense, from a defamation case by these statements. This is something that I think increasingly goes one way with the way that the current sort of ideology of a lot of the judicial system, and again, this ability to pick and choose exactly what environment you're in, plays a role here. So this is increasingly becoming, I think, one of the tools being used to silence dissent, and particularly those who have opinions that go very much against the standing wishes of the ruling regime.
Yeah, and I think that is the proper term, that it's being weaponized, essentially. And just for people who aren't terribly familiar, right, when we're talking about defamation, slander, or libel, we're talking about the basic argument here is that person A says something and then against person B, and then person C, D, E, and F then refuse to hire person B or ostracize person B or refuse to do business with person B, all based on what something person A said. Now, if we look at the history of this issue, you can find that obviously historically you did have people who would fight over issues of honor, right? You've impugned my family, so we're going to fight. And that actually the legal issue of defamation was in many ways invented to address the problem of duels. People who romanticize the past act like duels were some great thing, but of course the church has condemned dueling for many, many centuries because saying something nasty about a person in Christianity is not proportional to taking a human life. And so the idea of dueling has long been considered unacceptable. Of course, that didn't stop people from doing it. People listened to the Pope or bishops 500 years ago about as much as they do now. And so a lot of these legal issues were invented so that people had some way of, metaphorically speaking, having their day in court, right? So that, hey, so-and-so is bad-mouthing me constantly, and I just want him to stop. And so at least in the Anglo-Saxon countries, defamation suits, historically, they did exist, but penalties were often like nothing. They were small, minor, like a couple of pounds at most, sort of penalties, and it was designed to allow people to have a public voice, and it was not designed to bankrupt the person who lost the case or to impact them heavily financially. And that, of course, is a world away from where we are now, where you have a company like Dominion, and this is kind of what precipitated, I think, our thinking about why we should do this episode. And the bigger issue, it's not just this Trump defamation thing is actually a fairly minor issue in terms of the big scheme of things. I think the bigger issue is stuff like the Dominion lawsuit. Now, Dominion is this fake private company. So it's technically, legally a private company, but their revenues are virtually 100% government taxpayer revenues. And they're as much private sector company as any company that only does business with the government. And so they were claiming that people in the media, legit journalists in many cases, were saying nasty things about Dominion. That Dominion was somehow involved in vote faking and manipulation and that sort of thing, somehow related to the election being stolen. And this house somehow defamed Dominion, and Dominion incurred damages because of it. What were these damages? Difficult to see, since all their clients were government agents who probably weren't very much persuaded by what somebody on Fox News was saying or what Trump was saying and so on. But they managed to sue for hundreds of millions of dollars. They're still suing. They're suing the CEO of My-Pillow. They're suing Sydney, whatever her last name is, the attorney for Trump. They sued Fox News for $1 billion or so. They ended up settling for $780 million or something like that. These are absurd numbers. The idea that Dominion suffered hundreds of millions of dollars in damages is garbage. And on top of that is the fact that Dominion is essentially a government agency. And you can start to see immediately the dangers of not only just defamation overall, but the idea that a government agent or a taxpayer-funded entity of any kind could then sue for defamation. Because what you've got now is a monopoly organization that taxpayers are being forced to pay for, and then they're turning around and suing members of the public for saying nasty things about them. And since the 1960s, it's been a legal precedent in the U.S. that a government agency, a government person cannot sue for defamation. And the reason for that was a case, I believe it was Sullivan versus New York Times, 1968 or so, where what you had was local government agents, sheriffs in some cases, or local police chiefs and so on. The New York Times was saying nasty things about them in terms of enforcing Jim Crow laws and that sort of thing. And so these local guys decided, well, you know what, I'm going to sue the New York Times to shut them up because I'm tired of them criticizing me. And so they sued. And it went up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, no, this is nonsense, the idea that these public figures can sue a private organization to shut them up. And if you're a public figure, you're open to criticism. If you don't like it, stop being a public figure. And I would add, if you don't like being criticized by the taxpayer, stop being a taxpayer-funded entity, Dominion. And so you can see how it's kind of spiraling down now, where you're being forced to pay for organizations that then sue the private sector for criticizing them. And this is a very bad trend, and it absolutely is the weaponization, as you say, and it'll be interesting to see where it goes from here.
Right, and some of the other individuals included, I mean, it was Sidney Powell, as you mentioned, Rudy Giuliani has been personally targeted. Our friend Patrick Byrne has been targeted, and in his case, it was for having analysts of his create a report that had some concerns there, and they're trying to make an example out of these people to silence any sort of dissent about the sacredness of the democratic process. And don't you know, there's never, ever been any serious issues of voter integrity or concerns about voting machines, which of course, you could have found, published in, such fringe places as the New York Times prior to 2020. And it's a way of trying to silence, trying to weaponize the court system against those who have very serious concerns about, institutions like Dominion, it's something that, there is so much, the justice system, the legal system has been seen for the most part as, that last sort of institution of somewhat political norms. We've seen the respectability of Congress go way down, deservedly so. We see the office of the presidency become extremely polarized. We're seeing attacks right now on the Supreme Court as a very specific entity, with some of the allegations being made against Clarence Thomas in particular. And you're already starting to see the drumbeats of, we've got to disqualify, Supreme Court decisions that certain people don't like because Clarence Thomas was involved in it and he has to be removed and things like that. The court system, which has plenty of problems, right? There's all sorts of very, very real issues in a variety of ways from the court system. That was always kind of, however, seen as a politically neutral sort of institution. And I think the breakdown of that facade is very important. And it's going to be interesting to see, that the state level aspect of this is very interesting as well, because now again I think that one of the trends that I've really kind of become interested in personally is we're kind of seeing. I think all this is kind of baked into a certain bit of like a civil liberties framework and the 20th century breakaway from property rights to civil rights, and now increasingly those civil rights now include, right, the ability to not have someone say nasty things about you, right? So that is protection, particularly if you're in a certain group that the state favors. And this has been something that I think has ratcheted things politically, has grown interventionist policies, has eroded property rights and the like. And so it's going to be interesting to see if, is this a dynamic where the right does what it so often does and it complains about mistreatment, yada, 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 and has no response to it? Or is this something where, states try to take an active role in trying to protect citizens from this sort of legal threat, similar to how you saw certain legal protections over, vaccine mandates and things like that when you saw that sort of pressure from the federal regime. Because again, we see that in this political dynamic, again, the entire concept of the sort of liberal norms of difference of opinion, of allowing for some level of coexistence, and kind of the recognition that you're going to have certain people that have very hostile, heated arguments. Again, as you mentioned, there's certainly going back to all of American history, you've had people that have said very, very nasty things about different political opponents, about different entities. The Hamilton Burr debate, which, going back to your point about the church's condemnation of dueling, I think even Hamilton had his the priests were very concerned about how to deal with that, given that situation there. So this is something that has long historical precedence in American history.
Well, they had to go across state lines, right, in order to do the dual legally.
And so increasingly, this is something that we're now in a time where this cannot be accepted, and so this is not they would love to see again. Fox News settled, and I think their settlement was just short of $800 million. I think the original lawsuit was something north of $2 billion. There's also been legal action against Newsmax, against OAN, against some of these instances. It's simply for platforming certain people like Sidney Powell. And again, I'm not here to defend the veracity of what Sidney Powell was claiming. It seems that Tucker Carlson's opinion of Sidney Powell kind of mirrors mine in that regard. But you're already seeing, and again, I think that Tucker situation that we talked about last week plays into this. While there are different claims being made about, why was Tucker kicked off of Fox, I saw a report last night that, one of the board members of Fox News said that, the Dominion lawsuit aspect was one of the reasons why his show was canceled, not technically fired yet because he's still on the payroll, but that show was canceled. And so you get, again, that larger self-censoring dynamic if you have this one big bad entity that has an army of lawyers that are serving as de facto activists for a very powerful entity. That threat of having that sword above you is going to certainly change the way that private companies operate and censor content out there. And that's something that, again, I think is contributing to this increasingly stifled free speech environment.
Yeah, that's an important point too, is that we can find cases where, especially in countries where it's easier to prove defamation, one of the great things about America, my listeners will be shocked to hear me sing the praises of the greatness of America. But one of the great things about America is that freedom of speech has been way more absolute here than in most places. And it's been under attack. It's on its last legs. Hopefully we can fight back. But in most countries, there's not nearly as much freedom of speech. And part of that tradition has been that it's been very difficult to prove libel historically or prove defamation historically in the United States. You have to prove that the person said something that was untrue, that they knew it was untrue, that they wanted to do you harm. And proving intent is very difficult in a real court of law. In federal courts, it's intent doesn't matter that much. Just yet another illustration of how bad federal courts are. But historically, it's very hard to prove intent. And so people will shop around different countries when they're rich for a good place to sue someone for defamation. Or they'll even shop around in states, because even within the United States, there's a bit of a variation from state to state as to which state makes it easier to sue for defamation in. It's not a coincidence that Johnny Depp decided to sue Amber Heard for defamation in the state of Virginia. Because it was easier to prove defamation in that state. And that, of course, just proves our thing again, is just because Amber Heard says something, we're all automatically supposed to believe it and therefore stop watching Johnny Depp movies. I don't have a high opinion of either of these people particularly, but I couldn't care less what Amber Heard says about anything. So the idea that she's doing harm by just saying things nasty about Johnny Depp, isn't it the people who refuse to do business with Depp based on the rantings of some crazy woman? Aren't they the ones actually doing the harm? So it's hard to see how she is directly imposing any sort of real harm on him with words. Nevertheless, different states have different views on that. And Depp had the money and the ability to sue for defamation. Most people don't. But in, say, in the United Kingdom, where it's easier to prove defamation, and to a lesser extent in the United States, because it's so hard to prove. But in both cases, you will have cases where very wealthy parties will sue people for defamation just to shut them up. And you can tie them up in court, and you can get, of course, court orders against them and gag orders, and you can't talk about the case anymore while it's at trial. And there's all sorts of tricks that the wealthy can use using defamation law to shut up less powerful people. And in one of my articles on this, we'll link below, I note how this has been a long-used tactic by members of the various ruling classes in the Middle East. So when this has actually happened, where journalists have criticized the blood-soaked Saudi dictators, and someone then from those groups of people, some prince, Saudi prince, then sues the journalist in British court. They know they wouldn't get very far in American court, so they sue them in British court because that publication circulated in the UK. And so now that person can never travel to the UK, or they're going to face huge penalties. And they've succeeded, these horrible people who are essentially government agents in these countries committing horrible human rights violations, they can sue journalists to shut them up because that's quote-unquote defamation. And that's not something they invented. The rich people can use defamation laws to destroy poor people. And it's been done many, many times. And as long as you have those laws on the books, freedom of speech is not absolute. And it can, of course, then be applied just arbitrarily. I just don't like this person. They said something mildly critical of me. I've got a bunch of extra money floating around, so I'm going to budget $10 million this year to ruin that person. for saying bad things about me, for criticizing me. And that's the way business is done. It's the laws of the scales of justice in this case are whoever can pile the most money on one side of those scales will get what they want. And defamation laws go a long way toward making that a reality.
And touching upon the point you made about kind of the uniqueness of the American tradition of free speech, I think it is worthwhile noting, if we compare it to those other bastions of modern liberalism, particularly Europe and Canada, we're seeing, particularly I think in Canada, there's two cases recently that I saw where I think we see that ratcheting effect up of the weaponization of libel and defamation law. And again, surprise, surprise, here are one of them was Greenpeace, successfully after years in court, having court victories over a logging company, that said, that claimed that Greenpeace was, guilty of malicious lies, raising money for their organization by claiming that they were destroying Canadian forests. Greenpeace sued the logging company for defamation, and recently the Greenpeace won a major victory on that, which again I think you can kind of see that the larger agenda there probably played a role. If the roles were reversed, I have a feeling the logging company would be less successful with Greenpeace given the dynamic of Canada. You also saw an attorney with defending the Canadian Trucker Freedom Convoy, protesting the vaccine tyranny of Trudeau. He had to settle out of court after making claims that some of the Nazi flags and the Confederate flags, in some of the protest and demonstration areas were planted, right, to defame and to knock down the validity and the good nature of the majority of the protesters there. He was brought up by defamation charges. He had to settle out of court, and the details are not revealed, but I'm sure it cost him money. In Europe, the last time I saw kind of a comprehensive report on the defamation laws in Europe was 2015, which is kind of an entirely different world now, right? This was a nonprofit criticizing the harshness of European defamation laws as a threat on free speech. I have a feeling that, again, the tone there has now changed, where it's important to have that sort of restriction because we can't allow another Brexit on our hands, right? But the number of European countries that not only have very strong tools in the can for enforcing defamation lawsuits, but can explicitly arrest you and serve criminal charges, that you can serve jail time for defamation, is quite high. And so again, this is something that there is a uniqueness within. It's not often that we can wave the American flag and be on Team America. And again, this is the dynamic, though, is that we are there is, I think, a concerted effort to Europeanize Americans' concept of free speech, and some of this has been baked into. I have an attorney friend who has talked about for years the way that social media companies, and obviously Twitter now is a little bit of a different dynamic with Elon Musk on board, but that the de facto legal basis that social media companies and big tech have been using to filter their content has been, relying upon European law, international, that international dynamic, rather than any sort of, American respect for freedom of speech when they are writing their censorship rules for their own companies. And so this is where, again, I think the cesspool, the European unionization of, the West is something that I think is definitely at play here. And I think it's, again, this is why this is such a major issue on this front.
Yeah, I think the continent is even worse than the UK in terms of defamation law and ease of suing. So, you're not going to get much help there. I mean, as you say, you can get arrested for saying something that's interpreted as anti-Semitic and things like that. So, I mean, just astounding what you can be hauled into court for in terms of saying things. And I thought we were beyond the whole idea here among libertarians or freedom-promoting people, this idea that words are violence. But in my most recent defamation article, we had some of one guy recognized as a regular reader saying that, oh, well, you have to have defamation laws in place because saying nasty things about people is a form of aggression. I'm like, listen to yourself. This is exactly what the left says. Silence is violence. Saying things is aggression. And hurting people's feelings means you should be jailed. I mean, it's apparently so baked into some people's heads that we're having a hard time even with some of our more devoted readers on this. And you can see how just inappropriate it even is now in the modern world. Most of this stuff, you can see how it might have made sense in a small village setting. So, and that's really where it comes out of, is we're an agrarian society. You live in a village, and the local lord or the local rich guy starts spreading nasty rumors about you. And since this guy controls employment in the village and is very powerful, you don't have anywhere else to go. You would have to pick up and move and leave the village, which back then, of course, was especially costly, just to move 50 miles down the road. And so you could even see how it might work in that case. And maybe in some settings it still might make some sense at a very local level. But for goodness sake, I mean, we're living in the age of the internet. People saying all sorts of things all the time. And we still think it's acceptable to just hear something somebody else said and just take it at face value. That would seem that that's the bigger problem in society, that people are so gullible and willing to believe just anything some rando says about some other person, and we really need to move beyond that. This idea that there's objective journalism, this idea that there's this correct reporting about things. I mean, isn't it obvious that the news, it's mostly opinion, it's the way it's framed, it's there to deceive, it's there to mislead. And we're constantly being misled. You can't even believe videos you see now because of deep fakes that people are saying things and AI fake voices and stuff. Boy, if we're in a world of hurt if we're still going to cling to this idea that just saying things based on this idea that everyone just believes whatever they're seeing or being told, that you can create a legal argument around that. I just don't see how that can survive much longer without just creating a complete legal free-for-all.
Right. I am looking forward to the AI Radio Rothbard episodes we'll have in the future. We'll have deep fake Ryan and we'll have deep fake me, and we can churn out a lot of content with that. But yeah, I do have. Again, I have some sympathy with, okay, well, maybe, there's a role here for common law and a kind of a decentralized legal system. You may have some stronger protection somewhere rather than another. Fine. I mean, I think any sort of pursuit of some sort of universalist, legal regime has inherent problems that come with universalistic politics. But again, ignoring just the realities of the way that the enforcement mechanisms exist as they are right now, and to not see that there are certain powerful forces that are very explicitly illiberal in nature that have completely given away any sort of concept of tolerance or persuasion or ideological debate. You have to recognize again, and we've already seen it, and I think that the trend that, and it mirrors again the trends on big tech censorship, right? Where they started off with Alex Jones getting kicked off of Twitter and a bunch of hateful people getting kicked off of Twitter, and I'm not trying to conflate the two. I don't think Alex Jones is a hateful person. You had certain regime libertarians and others celebrating this as, oh, this is an example of a private company at work. And then it starts going into people questioning vaccines and the COVID vaccine or COVID policies in a general sense. And you always start in the same way that the weaponization of the money and banking system started off with debanking Al Qaeda allies. And who would argue that? Because Al Qaeda allies obviously bad, North Korea bad. But you start breaking enough, you start getting aggressive enough, you start having again these policies that I think are increasingly if we recognize that the progressive tendency is always baked into this sort of imperialistic, crusade of their ideology, that ideology has changed over time. I'm certainly not going to assert that the cultural views of Woodrow Wilson are the same as AOC in today's world, but that progressive mentality continues to exist, and you see the makeup of the court system. And this goes into a whole nother dynamic, right? We could talk about the way that the academic system and all the state subsidies in there, the changing of the incentive structures that prioritize those of a certain ideology, right? If you're applying to Harvard law or Yale law, the value increasingly placed upon, your life experience, which often, is rewarded from, being a participant in all the right causes and doing this X, Y, and Z, rather than, your LSAT score, right, or some of these raw measurements of competency or critical thinking skills. You have an entire shift. The starting at the academic level, you're having a shift in the type of judge that you're getting. The Biden administration is, and there's now been also this sort of race within the political system, right, of packing the court system. So Trump passed more judges than Obama did. By a great number. Now Biden already 2 years in has has appointed a lot more judges than Trump did in his 4 years, right? So there's this arms race within the judicial system that is, again, skewed by the feeding mechanisms into elite law schools. And when you consider, again, what that ideological lens is going to have, we should be very skeptical. We should not see these things as neutral institutions simply trying to find justice and protect people from egregious torts. These are politicized institutions, and particularly on the level, the scale of a Dominion lawsuit of some of these others. There is a larger political objective and goal there, and it would certainly be naive to overlook that very, I think, increasingly obvious fact.
Yeah, I think that's an important point to be made. And yeah, let's let that be the last word then on this episode of Radio Rothbard.
Well, before we sign off, though, speaking of, again, our audience, obviously, being Radio Rothbard listeners, I know they are not fooled. They are not bamboozled by the state in this regard. But I do want to give a shout out to a few people that have purchased our fantastic Radio Rothbard mug that I am enjoying. And this includes Brian in Arizona. We actually had a lot of Brians. We have a Brian in Arizona, in Las Vegas, one even in Panama City Beach, Florida, which I got to find. A David in Brooklyn, a John in Stafford Springs, Colorado. Have you been to Stafford Springs, Colorado?
I confess I have never heard of Stafford Springs.
Well, then, we've got reaches everywhere. So again, we've had a few others, including I know Mark Thornton has his own shiny new Radio Rothbard mug that he will be debuting next time he's on this show. So I do want to thank our listeners who have purchased their very fine Radio Rothbard mug, and you're certainly appreciated out there.
Well, and of course, I certainly have my mug, and who knows what other swag we will have over the years. We shall see. Where I feel very fortunate. So our traffic has been growing, and so we do have more listeners. We do appreciate all of you, those of you who share it. I'm surprised. I'm surprised people like the show as much as they do. So that's wonderful.
There's a demand for McMaken. Yeah. We're still working.
Truly shocking. But thank you, everyone, for tuning in to this episode of Radio Rothbard. And, of course, we'll be back again next time with more. And so until then, have a great week.